Hey, very good. So we're continuing. This is class four, and thank you all who've sent me comments. We're back, Baruch Hashem, and we're in chapter four, which is Torah, History, and Science, and we'll continue. We're right where we left off. I spoke about Rabbi Rav Kook's student, Moshe Zaidel. I mean, it's spelled in English with an S, although in Hebrew it's with a Zion. Growing up in my town, the shamus of the shul was his name was also Moshe Seidel. We called it Zaidel, but it was Seidel. He died before I even knew anything about this Moshe Seidel. I wonder if they were related, but I guess he came from Europe as well. So remember, we said that Zaidel was one of the people that Rav Kook sends to get an academic education. He becomes an expert in Tanakh. Mosada Rav Kook published a collection of his articles, and in one of Rav Kook's letters to him, some of Rav Kook's letters in the first volume of his he wrote are the most important letters Rav Kook wrote. He says, hold on a second. He says as follows. I just want to pull up the chat so I can see everyone. He says. He raises the issue of how to understand passages in the Torah that appear to be at odds, factually, they appear to be at odds with the Torah's description. Now, often when Rav Kook discusses this, it appears that he's discussing creation. You have signs of a billion-year-old world versus what the Torah says, but I don't think that's what he's referring to in this letter. He speaks of matters described in the Torah that conflict with what he terms chakira. What is chakira? Chakira is historical and scientific research, and the principle, I believe, he's setting out would apply to any historical description in the Torah that are at odds with what will be regarded as fact, not theory, but what, to the best of our knowledge, is fact. Because we'll see with Rav Herzog, and Rav Kook holds this as well. I mean, this goes back to the Rambam, that by definition, if something is a fact, it can't be at odds with Torah. And therefore, if something appears to be a fact, you need to explain how it would work with Torah. Rav Kook says this in his letter on evolution. He says that when we have a theory like this, we have to build Torah around it to show how it would work with Torah. And then, once you show that, if it's not proven, then you can try to refute it if you wish. But you need to show how it would work because it might become accepted scientific truth. And in Rav Kook's day, of course, evolution did not have the scientific standing it has today. But he was responding to, because it's very dangerous if you're going to say that by definition Torah is opposed to this, and then if it becomes the accepted fact in science, then you've destroyed Torah. So Rav Kook understood that it couldn't work this way. Um, Now, Zaidel is involved with academic biblical studies, so he's aware of a lot of these problems. So that's why I think that Rav Kook is referring to all historical matters that might be at odds with what the Torah says. And what Rav Kook says to Zaidel is that even if the Torah's descriptions are not entirely accurate, there must be an important and sacred reason it was presented this way. I think we can all understand this when you speak about, for example, Migdal Bavel, the tower going up to heaven. What does it mean going up to heaven? It's a description. Or we can, we spoke already about the sun rising and setting. You can say, well, that's not factual because the sun doesn't rise uh, technically, but that's how people see it. So you could say we all understand that that's how the Torah presents it. You don't need Rav Kook to tell us this. I think this is obvious and was understood before Rav Kook. But Rav Kook is expanding this into other areas. And in order to show that it's a valid approach, he adopts two very interesting parallels, I think. One, he speaks about Yafat Torah. Yafat Torah is the captive woman, the woman of beautiful form, I think is how the new JPS translates it, where you're at war and you see this woman you like and you grab her and basically you take her and she's yours. And you have a waiting day period to see if you want to get rid of her again. But the Gemara already speaks about how this law is not a good thing, that this is a concession. The Gemara already mentions this, that it's a concession human passions, but it's not ideal. The ideal thing would be to be a mensch and not to have these desires. But in the real world, this is a concession. Rav Kook, and we're going to get back to Yafat Torah later, because Rav Kook also has very interesting things to say about the morality of the Torah. Is the morality of the Torah the absolute morality? It would appear from this, obviously, no, that we can move beyond this. And we're going to see what Rav Kook has to say about this. But now he mentions Yifat Toar not to speak about morality per se. That's not his point. His point here is only to show, and he's going to talk about morality, and that's going to be a very important thing, not next class, maybe the class after. What is a Torah morality? And can Torah morality change? We'll see later a difference between Rav Kook and Rav Lichtenstein on this very point, which I learned over Yontif. But Rav Kook here is not citing this to speak about morality per se and how we deal with these matters. He's citing it for a different point. Namely, if we can acknowledge, which he does, that Yafat Toar is not the ultimate morality, it's a concession, and the ultimate morality would be beyond this, but it's a concession for the real world. The proper thing, as I said, would be for a soldier never to avail himself of Yifat Torah. Rav Kook says, just like the morality of the law of Yifat Torah is not perfect, but a concession to human weakness, so too various descriptions in the Torah don't have to be perfect. It is historically accurate. They could be presented in a certain way in order for the people who the Torah was given to their time for it to be more understandable. And let me turn off my sound here on my phone. Um, so that's the parallel. The morality of the Torah doesn't have to be the ultimate perfect morality. It deals with the reality before them. So too, descriptions in the Torah of every sort, historical descriptions, scientific descriptions, are time bound in the sense that they're given with a certain era in mind, but it doesn't need to. So, for example, the Torah can speak about the entire world. Let's say talk about the flood story, the entire world. Does the entire world mean people living in America or down in Africa, or does the world mean the world as it was known for those people? I mean, that's the sort of thing Rav Kook is speaking about. That statements in the Torah don't need to be accurate with a capital A in a factual scientific sense. They just need to be accurate in a it's like a for our lawyers, you'll appreciate this. You speak about the truth and then you speak about a courtroom truth. You can have a courtroom truth that isn't factually true, but for the purpose of what goes on in the court, that's the truth. And it's the same thing. The Torah is given at a certain time. And therefore, the truth doesn't have to be a capital truth in all of its matters. Now, do you find this radical? I mean, I think some people will find it radical. There's other things which I think everyone is going to find radical. This, I don't know how radical it is, but that's what he says, that the Torah needs to describe matters in what we might call a, quote, popular fashion, even if the descriptions are not entirely accurate. And look, Rav Kook, he doesn't cite the Rambam, but he could have cited the Rambam because the Rambam says that the Torah describes God. Forget, hold on, it's the computer actually. Let me shut this down. The sound on my computer here. In case you're hearing it, the second, you might. Can't figure out how to do this now because it's not on the right screen. Okay, the Torah doesn't just describe God as having a physical form; it describes God with emotions. Well, does God have emotions? So you could say the Torah speaks in the language of men, but the Rambam doesn't say that. He goes further than this, and we're going to see this as well. The Rambam says that it's important for some people to believe that God has emotions, that God really gets angry, that he has the emotion of anger. Later, when you advance beyond this, you'll understand that God doesn't have emotions and that God, he responds in a way that if someone, a human, let's say, who had anger would maybe respond this way, but God doesn't have anger. But this is what the Rambam calls emunah hechrachit, that for the average person, they're supposed to believe in this. The Torah is written on multiple levels. So that's the first point. And the Rambam gives the Rav Kook gives a second example. We don't need to get into that. You can find it in the book on page 43. Elsewhere, Rav Kook expands on this. And Rav Kook has a book, a very important book called Eder Hayakar. This is how, let me show you how it's, Rav Kook, you need to let me share my screen. Sorry, Rav Cook, Rabbi Kelman. I need to share my screen. I want to show. Okay, thank you.
Sorry about that. Sorry, I forgot to
No
declare
problem.
today.
If you
Okay.
look in the book of Zechariah, chapter 11, verse 13, you have the verse here where it says, V'yomer Hashem Elai, Hashlichei El Hayotzer, Eder Hayakar. So the um, the goodly price. I mention that because look at the Yud. It has a Shava under it. So most people transliterate this as Eder Hayakar with a kamatz under it, but it's not Hayakar, it's Hayakar. And incidentally, it's no different than another thing. If you look in Mishlei, chapter 20, verse 15, what do you see? Yesh Sahav v'rav peninim. There's gold and a multitude of rubies. Uchli yakar siftei dat. But the lips of knowledge are a precious jewel. So we have a commentator on Rav Ephraim Lunshitz. If you come with us to Prague, you'll see his grave, and he wrote a commentary called the Kli Yakar. So it should be transliterated Yekar, but everyone translates it as Kli Yakar. Um, with like as a kamats. In fact, they just came out. I think it was Art Scroll with an English translation, and they call it the Kli Yakar. The Kli Yakar. That's how we know it in yeshiva, but it's technically not. It's the Yakar. And he wrote this book called Eder HaYakar. And Rav Kook there explains that when it comes to same sort of thing we've been speaking about, this is an early work of Rav Kook published, that the message of the Torah is not concerned with astronomy. You can't look in the Torah and say, well, it teaches Copernican or Ptolemaic astronomy. And by the way, that was how people looked at the Torah. And early figures rejected Copernicus because they said it's in opposition to the Torah. Rav Kook says it has nothing to do with this. It doesn't teach us geological truths, by which I mean primordial historical truths. Rav Kook says explicitly, Torah expresses itself through man's nature, which means in accord with what was believed by the people at the time the Torah was revealed. I mean, he says explicitly by the time the Torah was revealed. Later, he says through man's nature. It's the same thing. Um, and this is in order that the Torah can accomplish its goals. Its goals is not to give us scientific and historical knowledge, but rather knowledge of God and ethics, etc. Let me read to you what David Schatz, Professor David Schatz, as far as I know, he has not yet retired, longtime professor at Yeshiva University. In summarizing Rav Kook's position, he says as follows. Even if the biblical accounts are not factually correct in all details, it is in their capacity to inspire, to provide moral direction, to impress upon us the nexus between our deeds and our lots, and to inculcate a general belief in God's hegemony over creation that is important. This opens up the possibility that the biblical account of creation is false and its mode of expression is historically bound. This is what the Professor Schatz says is absolutely correct. In his summary, he doesn't know when he wrote this, he didn't have access to the new works of Rav Kook, but the Eder Hayakar is already an older work. And that's what Rav Kook says. I think many people in the modern Orthodox world intuitively have understood this for a long time. I think as you move more into the more right-wing world, we saw what happened with the Slifkin controversy, this point is rejected. Not only is it rejected, it is declared actually heretical. And they do regard Torah's descriptions as teaching not just historic history in all of its. Now, obviously, Rav Kook still acknowledges there's history in the Torah, but that doesn't mean that every point has to be historical. And so, not only when you move to the right, it's not just history, but it's also science, that it's teaching us scientific facts. Now, if you say it's teaching us history, well, then that means that the world is under 6,000 years old, and that's going to be a problem, obviously. And if it's teaching us science, then you have. So, I mean, this runs into problems. But Rav Kook's approach, I guess, removes all these problems. He continues in Eder Hayakar, and in words very similar to what he wrote to Seidel, he says that, listen to this, prophecy, when it guides humanity, formulates its message, quote, in accord with what was generally accepted in those days so that the listeners could properly grasp it. We've seen this already. Prophecy is time bound in its descriptions. That means that prophets, in describing things, can describe them even though scientifically it's inaccurate, even though it's historically inaccurate, either because the prophet himself or herself thought this, or because the prophet was explaining it, was expressing it for the people of its time. But Rav Kook doesn't just say this. He says something else, which opens up a whole Pandora's box, which we'll try to enter into. He says that what I just told you, that prophecy is in accord with how people grasp it, quote, this is in accord with the view of the Rambam and the explanation of Shem Tov on Guide 3.7 at the end, and the simple understanding of the Jerusalem Talmud at the end of Ta'anit regarding the mistaken calculations of the ninth of Tammuz. So what is this about? I'm going to unpack this for you. It's amazing, actually. But first, again, a repetition of this point that prophecy uses conceptions generally accepted, even if not necessarily correct. And there's no attempt at, let's say, scientific accuracy. Now, I'll read you what Rav Soloveitchik says. Rav Soloveitchik, who's not a follower of Kook, but he says something very similar. Listen to Rav Soloveitchik. Quote, if the Bible employed the Ptolemaic description of the cosmos, Ptolemaic meaning that the everything, the Earth and the planets revolve around the sun. So Rav Soloveitchik says, if the Bible employed the Ptolemaic description of the cosmos, it was only to present to the people of its time and not to present the true scientific view. So that's what Rav says. Is that what people? That's what people believed. So since that's what people believed, that's how prophecy is expressed. Not that you know the prophet speaks in the language of man. Everyone knows it's not true, but that's how people speak. No, that's how people understood it. Therefore, it's expressed this way. Now, if you follow this approach of Rav Kook, you're not going to be disturbed if you see things in the prophets or even the Torah which are not in accord with the facts as we know them today, for the simple reason that the audience at the time, thousands of years ago, did think it was that way. So, for example, the Torah doesn't describe a universe billions of years old because that's not part of the mental conception of the ancient Israelites. It doesn't speak of how the earth is in motion. Rav Kook says it does not speak of how the earth is in motion because if people thought that the earth was in motion, they would have been afraid to build tall buildings because the movement would cause it to collapse. Now, I don't know if that's true. In fact, Rav Kook says that if they knew, they also would have been afraid to stand up because they would have been knocked over. Now, obviously, that a little bit of trial and error would have shown that they wouldn't have fallen down. But his point is that the Torah's truths, because everything, the scientific truths, historical truths are all part of the Torah's truths, were not designed to be revealed to what we can call primitive man. Now, if you recall what I read to you before, where if Kook says that prophecy is formulated in accord with the generally believed, then he says this is in accord with the Rambam, as was explained by the commentary Shem Tov on the guide. What does this mean? He doesn't tell us what this means. So you have to look at Shem Tov's commentary. If you look in the Guide of the Perplexed, if you have the Hebrew Guide of the Perplexed, and incidentally, there's these people in the Haredi world. They come out of Bnei Brak, as far as I know, because hold on a second. I want to show you this. You have to see. I think if I have it here, then I can just grab it. Unfortunately, it's not here, so I can't show it to you. But it's a wonderful. Hold on a second. Maybe I do. I have it. Look at this book. What an amazing book this is. This is called More Nevuchim LaRambam. It's only volume one, chapters 1 through 30. So we'll need another 6 or 7 volumes. It came out 2023, and it was put out by Machon Hagut V'dat Yisrael Bnei Brak. So this comes out in Bnei Brak. It's an edition of the More Nevuchim with the commentaries, the standard commentaries, and it also has Caspi and Narboni. And by the way, if you know who Caspi and Narboni are, you're talking about radical interpreters of the guide here. And it has Shem Tov and Ephodi, and it has other commentaries in the back from manuscript. Amazing piece of work here. I got it right as I was finishing the book. But even if you don't have that, if you have the standard edition of the standard edition of the guide has four commentaries on the page. It has a Fodi, Profiat Duran, that's he's called a Fodi. It has Shem Tov, which is a more detailed, longer commentary. It has Kreskas. This is not Chastai Kreskas, although commonly people make this mistake. His name is Rabbi Asher Kreskas. There, and then it has a Barbanel. By the way, one of the Yashar of Kandia, the Joseph Shlomo Del Medigo, compared the four commentators on the guide. He didn't deal with a Barbanel. Instead of a Barbanel, he deals with Narboni, and he compares them to the four sons at Pesach. Narboni is the Russia because of his radical interpretations, and Kreskas is the Tom, the simple one. Because if you read Kreskas, it's like I mean, I don't want to say it, but this is what Delmenigo is saying, that he doesn't really begin to grasp what the Rambam's talking about, doesn't really understand the philosophy, and he's a Tom. Incidentally, the if you look at the Yerushalmi and the Mechilta on Pesach, instead of Tom, it actually has a Tipesh, a stupid one. That's the version they have there. And if you look, there's an early American Haggadah. And for the Russia, it has a picture of a boxer, which I find amazing because, if you go back to the 1920s in America, Jews were boxers. They were involved in boxing. It was a good Jewish sport. But you can imagine the Jew. I had an uncle who was a boxer. He was a champion, I'm told, of the whole area in Fargo, North Dakota. And he fought, and that's my grandfather's brother. My great grandparents didn't know about it. He fought. His name was Donald Shapiro, but he fought under the name Doc O'Day, because he didn't want his my great grandmother to know that he's a boxer. It's not exactly a good job for a Jewish person, but that's you can assume anyone who's a boxer, he's going to be not really Shomer Torah and mitzvos. So, although there was that Chabad boxer a few years back. Incidentally, this boxer, my great uncle Donald Shapiro, his son is Neil Shapiro, Neil Shapiro. If you don't know who Neil Shapiro is, look him up. Silver and bronze medal at the 1972 Munich Olympics, considered the greatest American equestrian Olympiad ever. And he's still raising horses not far from where I am now. So you can look it up, Neil Shapiro. Okay, getting back to Rav Kook and Shem Tov. Shem Tov discusses the Rambam, the way Shem Tov explains it. The Rambam's cryptic. He's always cryptic, but the way Shem Tov explains it is also how you find in the other commentaries, that basically the Rambam's view is that the prophet Yecheskel made a scientific error. And I'll tell you what this error is in a few minutes. And that's when Rav Kook says that the prophets speak in accordance with the people's understanding. It's not just people's understanding; it's also it's also the prophet's understanding, because it says prophecy formulates this message in accordance with what's generally accepted. So even the prophet makes a mistake. So the Rambam tells us, he doesn't tell us explicitly, but the way, if you read him, it's clear this is what he's saying, that Yecheskel made an error. So why did Yecheskel make an error? And we'll get to that in a few minutes. But Shem Tov explains that when the prophets, according to the Rambam, he's like Rashi on the Rambam, that what the Rambam's telling us, and this is what Rav Kook is telling us to look at, is that when the prophet speaks about prophecy, he's a prophet, divinely inspired. But when the prophet speaks about philosophical and scientific matters, then he's speaking just as a wise man, and a wise man can be mistaken. And unlike Moshe Rabbeinu, whose words come word for word, prophecy from God, no, the prophet gets the idea and then expresses it in his own language. So the prophet, in expressing it, is, since he's only human and he lives in that time and he's subject to the same mistakes, scientific, historical, whatever mistakes that everyone else is, when he expresses his divine word, he uses the incorrect ideas which he thought were correct. Just like, and the proof of this for the Rambam, that Yecheskel, he believed a scientific falsehood, so his prophecy actually includes this The message of the prophecy is divine and true, but the form of it, you have to distinguish between form and matter. The matter is true, but the form of it, how he describes it, is false because it contains a scientific idea that we now know is not correct. And that's not important. What's important is the actual message, not the outer kernel of it. And what's the example that the Rambam refers to? Well, the Rambam explains that there's a dispute over whether, see, and this is a mistake of the Rambam also, but the Rambam assumes that he's adopting the Greek idea of astronomy. He assumes this is what Yecheskel believed as well. They believe in a Ptolemaic world. So the Earth is in the middle. We don't revolve. I think before I said Ptolemaic revolve around the sun. No, that's Copernican. Everything revolves around the Earth. Earth is the center. We're the most important. And what revolves? There are spheres. And each planet is in a sphere. And the sphere revolves. And as the sphere revolves, the planet also moves. So it's not like the planet's moving, the sphere is moving. Well, there was a dispute, he says, between the sages and Aristotle. The sages thought that when the spheres moved, it created sounds in the heavens. And Aristotle rejected this. And so that's the dispute. And who was right on this matter? Well, Aristotle is right that, according to the Rambam, that there are no sounds. And the lesson for this is that when it comes to, for the Rambam, is that when it comes to, and the Rambam is explicit about this, when it comes to scientific matters, we're not led by the sages because the sages could have been mistaken. They were not recipients of this knowledge, Torah Sinai. But then this is not all we find in the guide. This is in guide 2, book 2, chapter 8. The Rambam seems to be saying, and this is what the commentators all assume, pretty much all assume, Shem Tov certainly, that it's not just the sages who erred, it's also Yecheskel Hanavi. Because if you look at his description of the chariot, his great chariot vision in chapter 1 of Yecheskel, and chapter 3 later, he speaks about the wings of the chayot, the noise of the wheels, all this. And the way the Rambam understands this is that this whole chariot thing, this is an allegory for the spheres. But the Rambam is describing there being sound. So the way the Rambam sees it is that Yecheskel he includes as part of his prophecy the sounds made by the spheres, but the spheres don't make sounds. Therefore, we see that even the prophet, in descriptions, because he's relying on the best scientific knowledge he had, can be mistaken. So that's what the Rav Kook is referring to there. Very important. What is Rav Kook referring to when he speaks about? He says also about the Jerusalem Talmud in Masachet Tanit, according to the simple understanding. What does it mean by this? Well, if you look in here, let me show you this. If you look in the book of Jeremiah, uh, chapter 39, verse 2, what does it say? In the 11th year, Vashtei Asrei Shana Tzidkiyahu, the 11th year of Tzidkiyahu, in the fourth month is Tammuz, the ninth day of the month, a breach was made in the city. Okay, so here we see that the beginnings of the end, when they breached the wall, was on the ninth of Tammuz. And yet, if you look in the Mishnah and Tanis, it tells us that it occurred on the 17th of Tammuz, and we all know that day. Well, how are we to make sense of this contradiction? If you look in the Yerushalmi, it says as follows, quote, there is an error in calculation here. And what Tosfos explains, it quotes this Yerushalmi, that the people made a mistake, that the prophet is recording the mistake of the people, and the Tanakh includes this mistake because this is what the people believed. And if you look in the Karbaneda on the Yerushalmi, he says, quote, because of the many difficulties that is, the people erred in the calculations, and the Bible did not wish to change that which they rely on. In other words, Sefer Yirmiyahu records mistaken information because it's reflecting what the people believed incorrectly. Notice they don't say Yirmiyahu mistakenly believed this, although in theory you could say that as well, although it's a little hard to imagine. if Yirmiyahu got it, is it wrong? How is it that the sages of the Mishnah knew the correct thing? So I think the assumption here is that Yirmiyahu knew the truth, but he just recorded it because that's what people believed. Um, and That's amazing. So obviously there's a tradition that it's really the 17th, it's not the ninth, even though Tanakh says it's the ninth. But here we have a proof for Rav Kook that Tanakh can record things that are factually incorrect, but there's an important reason for recording it. And now that opens up a whole Pandora's box, as I said, because the lesson of this passage in Yerushalmi for Rav Kook is that you can apply this to other places in the Bible. That is to say, complete historical and scientific accuracy is not vital, and sometimes it can be sacrificed in the name of the Bible's higher truths. And I give all sorts of examples. You can come up with things. So, I mean, Rav Kook gives an example of this in when he deals with Talmudic Agadot. Rav Kook has a commentary called Einaya. It's not on the entire Talmud. It's on a few tractates. He wrote a commentary on Agadah. Unfortunately, he didn't finish it, didn't complete it. But what he has is great. I once heard Rabbi Rakefet say when he was in Rav Soloveitchik Shir, they're running Sanhedrin, and they skipped over the Agadot because the Rav wanted to focus on halacha. And Rakefet says, "What a loss this is! Had we spent time on the Agadot, can you imagine? The Rav would have had whole philosophy from these Agadot. But it's a smicha shir. You can't spend the whole semester dealing with the Agadot in the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin, and there's Agadot throughout Masachet Sanhedrin. So the Rav would go over. He didn't skip word for word. He just read it quickly. He read it and then moved on. In other words, he didn't go into it in detail and explain it. That's what he did in his drushot that he gave. So Rakefet has often lamented that would that the Rav have spent the same amount of time explaining the Agada that we read through quickly, that he did the halacha. So in his commentary on the Agada, Rav Kook takes up the passage by Shmuel bar Nachmani. A lot of people assume this is the unanimous view. It's not the unanimous view. It's the view of one Amora, but it becomes cited for whatever reason as the as a unanimous view, or as a stam position that everyone accepts it. What am I referring to? That Ruvain never actually had sexual relations with Bilhah, even though the Torah says explicitly he did. And I mean, the same thing that Shmuel ben Achmani says also about David HaMelech. And I mean, so, but if you look at the Gemara, you see that not everyone holds this view. And for some reason, this becomes the accepted view. I don't know why. Rav Kook explains that this is an important point here, because Rav Kook is assuming now that he's assuming that Rav Shmuel ben Achmani is correct, that Ruvain never actually slept with Bilhah, and yet the Torah says he does. So here's an example where Rav Kook says the Torah says something that historically is not true. It says that he slept with her, even though he did not, because it had an important reason, an important message to get across. And you can come up with all sorts of messages to talk about the importance of not committing sexual immoralities, honoring your father, all sorts of things. But we don't need to get into it right now. But the point is that something is recorded in the Torah that, according to this view, is not correct. And we saw, if you recall, Rav Kook doesn't mention this, but he could have, the Musar teachers. We saw the big dispute between the Chazon Ish and the Musar teachers. The Torah says that they, Bnei Yisrael worshipped idolatry, or this king did that. And the Musar teachers come along and say, like the Alter Sabat and others said, no, it doesn't really mean they worship idolatry. It means that they did not behave properly. So Tanakh makes it seem, attributes them idolatry, because they're at such a high level, so the little sin they did, it's as if they worshipped idolatry. And the Chazon Ish says that this is basically kafira. You're saying that you're saying that the Tanakh says one thing, and you're saying, well, it doesn't really mean that. And the Chazon Ish says, absolutely. So obviously the Chazon Ish knows this Gemara, but that's if the Gemara says it, okay, the Chazon Ish assumes there's a tradition. But a 19th century, a 20th century figure can't just come up and say, when the Navi says that they did X, that you say, well, he doesn't really mean the X. He's just saying that to teach us a lesson. The Chazon Ish absolutely rejects this. But here we have the Gemara. The Gemara is saying something that's not true, factually. But the Torah doesn't have to be true. And the Navi doesn't have to be true because sometimes they have a message they need to get across. Very important point. Okay. Now, after dealing with all of this, I
But
then move
who
on to,
was who was the father of Tamar's baby then? If he didn't, if it wasn't Yehuda, who was the father
well, we're
of?
not talking about Yehuda here. We're talking about Reuven and Bilhah.
Oh, I see.
Yehuda, and there's no um, the Musar teachers, as far as I know, don't deal with the Yehuda case. But if they did, they would say that he was Makadesh, or who knows what they would say. But we spoke about that. I don't want to get back into it. But the point is that the Musar teachers in this school of Musar agree with this idea that just because it says it black and white on the page doesn't mean it really happens as it's described. Now, so far, this is as far as Rav Kook goes. But this led me into something, and without even getting into, um, if you look on page 57 and on, I dealt with a number of medieval thinkers, liberal medieval thinkers, who had similar approaches. For example, how they dealt with the long lifespans that you can see this week's parsha, next week's parsha. I mean, what they do with that, and they had different ways of in interpreting it in line with a more scientific, rational approach. Rav Kook, by the way, doesn't seem troubled by any of this. Um, he says he presents the principle here, but he only really applies it to creation. That was what concerned him, how old the universe is. He wasn't concerned with, it seems from Irv Cook that once man is created, and man doesn't have to be created 6,000 years ago. It could be very long ago, but there was a time when the Torah is speaking about a man, and we read about it, and there's a genealogies. Once that begins, then we're dealing with real history. That seems to be Rav Kook's approach. There's no passage that I'm aware of where he expresses any question or doubt upon this and feels the need to reinterpret it. Although he does state, as we saw, that if you have good enough reasons, you can reinterpret it. But he himself didn't seem to think that there's good enough reasons. But that brings us to the next generation. And that's where Rav Kook's ideas were somewhat known, although not the new writings, but basically his ideas, the basic idea was known. I was able to flesh it out and in various ways and cite new sources. But Rav Herzog, the texts of Rav Herzog, which I published, are were all from manuscript. There was one article, Raphael Shuchat, published in the Torah Mata Journal, Letters of Rav Herzog to Velikovsky, where you see this as well. But it's quite fascinating because Rav Herzog deals with a completely different issue. Uh, like I said, he's the next generation, so he moves it one step further. And without even looking at what my book says, I want to read to you because I published a number of letters in which Rav Herzog expresses the same idea. But instead of doing that, I want to read you about something that I only recently published in the Sfarim blog. And here it is. And let me tell you what it says. Now, the problem with writing a book, and I've written a number of books, so it's always going to happen, is that you're ready to send the book in, you think you've covered it, and once the book is published, or even sometimes when it's in print, you uncover something which is dynamite, and you wish you could have included it, but it's too late. So fortunately, today we have things like the Sfarim blog, so I'm able to include it there, which I did with this article, with this piece. And one day I'll publish my collected essays and I'll update them. But of course, when that's published, then there'll be new stuff as well. But let me read you this letter. And this just is one of a number of letters. In the book, I cite a number of other letters where Rav Kook wrote, sorry, Rav Herzog, the successor to Rav Kook, the chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael, chief rabbi of the state of Israel, first chief rabbi of the state of Israel, an amazing genius, not just in Shas and Poskim, but he knew like 12 languages and his science and history, everything. So he was concerned with a completely different matter. And let me enlarge it here and I'm gonna read it so I can see it. And what I'm going to read to you right now is the exact same thing he expresses to various scholars, scientists he wrote to. This letter I discovered in Israel about a year ago in the archive of Ramosha Tzvi Neria. one of the leaders of Bnei Akiva in Israel. He was Rav in Kfar Aroa. Rav Herzog obviously passed it around to different people. And it's the same thing we see elsewhere, but since you don't see this in my book, I'll read it to you. It's addressed to Rav Zev Gold. He calls him Rav Zev Wolf Gold. I've never seen anyone refer to Zev Gold as Zev Wolf Gold. In English, his name was Wolf Gold, or in Yiddish. And in Hebrew, he's always known as Rav Zev Gold. Rav Zev Gold, I feel a kinship to him because he was a rabbi in Scranton, Pennsylvania. I think he was in San Francisco. Then he came to Scranton, where I'll be tomorrow. And then he comes to Williamsburg, and he's a rabbi in Williamsburg, and is also involved in the founding of Yeshiva Torah Vadas. The Torah Vadas, the name comes from the yeshiva in Lida, Rabbi Reines. Das there is supposed to mean like wisdom of the world. And he's an important Mizrahi figure. He moves to Eretz Yisrael. He moves to Israel. I'm not sure what year he moves to Israel. I have to check that. He moves to Israel before the Holocaust. No, sorry, he moves to Israel. It's a very good question. I have to look later. I'll look what year he moves to Israel because he's in the video, the famous video. It must be like 45 or something. He's the famous video of the March on Washington, where all the rabbis come and Roosevelt refused to meet with them. The vice president meets with them. You can find it on YouTube. It's only a couple minutes. I don't know where the rest of it is. Someone has the tape of it. I'd like to see the whole video of it. They show you a minute of a speech. Rabbi Eliezer Silver is there, but the speaker is Rabbi Zev Gold, calling upon the president to, help the remnants of the Jewish people, etc. I'd love to get the whole, newsreel of this. Um, we can identify interesting people in it, and so if anyone knows about that, let me know. But he goes to Israel. He becomes an important figure there, obviously, because he's leader of Mizrahi. He dies. He's not that old, in the 50s. Rav Soloveitchik was a great admirer for him. He wrote a hesped for him. Rav Yaakov Weinberg was very close to him. I have a trivia question, which I ask people. Who lived in Scranton and signed the Declaration of Independence, Israeli Declaration of Independence? There's a Scrantonian who signed it. And the answer is Rabbi Zev Gold. Rav Zev Gold signed, if you look at his name, is on the Israeli Declaration of Independence. Machon Gold of blessed memory. We might have people who went to Machon Gold. Hey, by now we have people whose mothers went to Machon Gold. Machon Gold disappeared when BMT disappeared. Um, that's named after Rav Zev Gold. So he writes to Rav Zev Gold as follows. He says, before you go to, now that you're leaving to Artzos Sabris, America, I want to go over with you shortly what we spoke about last week. And he says, the Rav Herzog says, that's my hope, if God gives me strength, to write a large book, a new Moreh Nevuchim, a book that is going to include answers from the standpoint of traditional Judaism for the sfeikot, for the doubts and the problems that affect Jews today, especially young people, and bring them to doubt in heavenly Torah. And it's led to heresy. He says, "L'tzareno hagadol," to our great distress, I need. Sorry, he says, I need the help of academics and archaeologists who believe, the few who believe in our generation. This because most archaeologists and academic scholars of the Bible, they're not believers. And he says this is what his principle is in this book, in dealing with the conflicts between Torah, as literally written, and what the scientists are telling us. He says, one, he's going to use the idea of Dibra Torah Kol Shon Bnei Adam, that the Torah speaks in the language of people. So if the Torah describes things in ways that didn't happen, that's because it's describing the way people would best understand it. And also he says, too, what the Rambam says. The Rambam says that if Aristotle proved eternity of the world, he would be able to explain the Torah in accord with that, so it's not an opposition. I think Rav Herzog and many others make a mistake here. The Rambam says that he could explain Torah in accord with Aristotle, but he also says that would be the end of Torah, because the Aristotelian God, the eternal universe, there's no room for a personal God. But he does say Plato. That not only can you explain the verses in accord with Plato, but it doesn't destroy Torah Judaism at all. You can believe in eternal matter. Okay, but leaving that aside, the word Herzog says is that the Rambam says if something, even like Aristotle, eternal universe is proven, not speculation, but proven, we can reinterpret the Torah. So if Herzog's point is, if you can show me that, let's say there never was a flood or worldwide flood, or there never, humanity has lived in this part of the world, let's say for 50,000 years, and it's not speculation, but it's a fact, well, then we'll have to reinterpret the Torah because that's what the Rambam says. If something is factual, you don't reject the fact, rather, you reinterpret the Torah. So then Rav Herzog says, however, we must determine whether the suppositions of archaeology about kadmoniot hamin hanoshi, that is, how long humanity has been around, if they're actually facts, or if this is just speculation. This is Rav Herzog's big point. And this is what he returns again and again when he's writing to the rabbis, the academics he's writing to, and the various scholars in archaeology and history. Is it really the case that humanity has been in existence for hundreds of thousands of years all over the world? Well, what then to do with the fact that there was a flood and we're all descended from this one person? Or what about the fact that we count? Yes, fine. Rav Herzog says in one of his letters, we do have this tradition that worlds were created, so there's no problem in saying that billion-year universe. But however, there also was a creation at one point of time, and the world we're in today is thought to be from that creation. And that creation is some 6,000 years ago, and we have a whole history, we have a genealogy. And if you tell me that people have been living here for 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 years, well, then there's a problem. But before we're going to start reinterpreting the Torah, before we're going to start saying that Torah is only speaking in the language of man, we need to know that this is a fact, that humanity's been around for a lot longer than 6,000 years. And that's the question he asks all these academics he writes to and archaeologists. Is it a fact that humanity's been around a lot longer? And he even explains why. He says in one of the letters that yes, we don't always have to take the Torah literally. We can reinterpret it, but we can't just willy-nilly, to use the word the Rav loved, just start reinterpreting. We have to know for sure. So, and he says in this letter, the Maimer Chazal, that God created worlds and destroyed them, that doesn't help us because, like I said, that refers to pre-history of man, previous worlds. But he says, according to Pshat of the Torah, the humanity, Hamin Enoshim Nimtza, is listed on this earth for a few thousand years from the time that Adam was created, from 5,000. 713 years ago. And he says, and if you count from the flood, it's less than that. Then Rav Herzog says, archaeology says that humanity is hundreds of millions of years it's been on Earth. I don't know if they say that, though. It says meot milyonim, but that's not what they say. I mean, there's I don't know whether pre-humans, Cro-Magnon. I don't know really anything about it, but I think they speak in terms of. I don't think they speak in terms of hundreds of millions, but it's not important. Anything over 6,000 creates the problem. So here he says, is the Tarikh archaeology, is the archaeological evidence? He focused on archaeology, not on other sorts of history, but archaeology evidence, is it Lamal Mikol Safek? And if it is Lamal Mikol Safek, that is, if it's without doubt, Azai Aleinu Lefaresh Mechadash, therefore we need to explain anew at Divrei HaTorah b'Sefer Bereshit. We have to reinterpret Bereshit. So even though on the face of it, it looks like it's describing a world that goes back less than 6,000 years old, we have to reinterpret it because we have to. Because if it's a fact that humanity is longer, you can't deny facts. By definition, they're facts. And the Torah doesn't want us to. Then he says, in this area, we need a pathway. Ematai, when can we reinterpret the Torah and remove it from its literalness? And how much? Rav Herzog doesn't know. He's trying to figure out how much we can reinterpret the Torah. He says that this matter, which he sees actually has halachic significance, because obviously if you're dealing with heresy, you're dealing with halacha. halachic implications, he said that he says that this is one of my main points that I have to deal with in this book. Unfortunately, he never wrote the book, so we have his questions, we have his approach that he's going to take, but we don't have his answers. We don't know what his conclusions are. He says that this book, which I'm going to write, has to cover all of science that refers to not just scholarship that refers to faith, Torah and Shemayim, not just the Torah, the written Torah, but the oral Torah. And he says that I need people to write articles to create I need articles to edit a book from the few academics who are believers. So in other words, it's not only going to be his book. Sometimes he portrays it as he's going to write this book, but here he's portraying it as it's going to have contributions of others, everyone in their field. Mikol echad b'miktzah. And then he says, but philosophy, what about philosophy? He says, philosophy is going to be an important part of this. And he says, in this generation, ani roeh, he says, in this generation, echad b'dor zeh hamasugal avodah zo. He says, there's only one person in our generation who can do a philosophical treatment and explain philosophically how we're supposed to deal with the new knowledge in line with Torah. Who is this person? That's the Gaon, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik Shlita. That's the Rav, who Rav Herzog knew because he had been in America a couple times, and he met Rav Soloveitchik there. Shehu Migaonei Torah. He's one of the Torah greats. And remember, 1953, the Rav is 50 years old here. And he's also Gaon B'Philosophia. He's a great scholar in philosophy. Anyone could have seen this from Halachic Man and the few other things the Rav wrote. And he's obviously a pious Jew. He says, I would write to him directly, but I think that if I approach him, he's going to reject, he's going to refuse. He says, therefore, I ask you, he knows that Zev Gold is close to the Rav, you speak to him and show him, Rav Herzog says, show him this letter and tell me what's his view and his opinion on this whole matter. And if he's willing to participate, namely to give tshuvat hayadut hanemana labayot hafilosophia, that to give the traditional Jewish answer to the philosophical problems that have been raised. That it's not just academic, biblical scholarship, scientific problems. There's also philosophical problems that have been raised with the new approaches, including, he says, including the new philosophies that are close to traditional Judaism, like Hermann Cohen and Franz Rosenzweig. He wrote his dissertation on Hermann Cohen, so he knew him very well. And he says to him at the end, don't publicize this until I'm ready to publicize this. Today the equivalent would be, we have all sorts of, basically he's saying the zeitgeist. The Rav can provide a philosophical answer from traditional Judaism to the problems of the zeitgeist, which the Rav did in his own writings. His later writings. And the equivalent would be today. If someone, well, what are the problems we have today? We have problems dealing with gender issues. Like if you were to write a modern day guide to the perplexed, you'd have to deal with gender issues. You'd have to deal with issues of sexuality. You'd have to deal with issues of knowledge. How do we know things? Postmodernism. So that's where Rav Herzog was saying. Oh, it's already 9:26. Let me go for another minute or two, though, because that's Rav Herzog. He has a number of other letters. I don't need to go into them. You can see them in the book. What I want to end today, though, and then we'll be able to pick up a next class with chapter 5, the problem of heresy, is this is how I end really the section after I deal with Rav Herzog. Rav Herzog, he didn't know Rav Kook's writings on this because it wasn't published, where Rav Kook already said that Rav Kook cites both the things he mentioned, that the Torah speaks in the language of men, that is the Torah and prophecy in general, speaks in accordance with what people's views were at that time. So therefore, this is an approach that Rav Herzog said that I'm going to do this, but what's the boundaries? And he also mentions, Rav Kook also mentions the Rambam's idea that if something's proven, that then we have to accept it. So therefore, we act just like the Rambam gave Torah true understandings, even in accord with with views like Aristotelian and Platonic views. Not that we accept it, but because we need to, for people who do accept that. And when it comes to Plato, if it is proven, we can accept it. So too, this is exactly what Herzog said. So he would have, as they say, made a Yom Tava or a Banan. He would have made a feast day if he knew that the very point he was arguing that Rav Kook already suggested using the same approach. But what a loss we are that we're at that Rav Herzog never wrote this book, so we don't know what he would have concluded. But notice he raises the questions already. So you see, the questions are not a problem. The most you could say is that certain answers are problematic, but the questions are not a problem, and the approach is not a problem. What I end this section is I say, which I find interesting, that the matter that so troubled Rav Herzog, at least in the modern Orthodox world, it seems to have been settled, even though no one ever discussed it. And I know of no theological discussion dealing with this. What do I mean by that? I said that I see no evidence that people in the modern Orthodox communities are concerned that in every single modern Orthodox school, students are taught that, say, around 10,000 BCE, farming communities existed. They take social studies, they'll learn that farming communities existed in the Middle East and North Africa. It's not like the Haredi schools with a cutout pages. These are in all the textbooks, history books, which will say this. And I know from personal experience also that this sort of information is found routinely in all, because modern Orthodox schools use regular textbooks that are used in public schools. I also say that even though that they use these books and they teach in the classes based on the assumption that human civilization predates the traditional Jewish reckoning, from what I've seen, and I even asked my children, this is presented to students without taking the step there Herzog mentions, namely, what then becomes of the Torah's chronology. It is a little strange when you think about it, that in the morning you're in Jewish subjects and you're learning the Torah, and in the afternoon you go into a class and you learn about, in India 10,000 years ago, the Aryan settlers came in to dwell there, and no one bothers explaining, well, how is it that 10,000 or 20,000 years ago, the Aryan civilization come down from Central Asia into India when we just learned in the Torah that the world is less than that, and they're not supposed to be anyone living up there. As far as I know, there's no explanation in any of the schools, and there's no book or anyone who's written about this. So I don't know how to explain this, and but this is the issue that Rav Herzog was so interested in, concerned with, and he wanted to explain from a Torah standpoint what to do with this. And I just find it fascinating that it seems that in the modern Orthodox world they've taken that step, and without any explanation of what then to do with the parshios that we're reading last week, we're reading this week. I mean, what to make of this? So that's how I end that section. I have one more point I think I want to make for that chapter, and then we will move into heresy. Cook has some fascinating things to say about heresy, but let me now take take the questions and the comments here. This is I find this fascinating stuff. So let's see, what do we have here? S is pronounced like a Z in German. Yes, yes, I know, but Susanna, believe me, that I know. But and in Yiddish, but in English, the one question is, why do we write it this way with an S in English? Why don't we write it with a Z when they I mean, they're assuming they're taking the way I guess it was translated into German and just keeping it the way it was. I mean, that's the answer. But in English, people start saying it with an S, Seidel, even though it's Jeff Seidel. Anyone who's been to the Kotel probably knows Jeff Seidel. Well, Jeff Seidel, his grandparents were not Seidel, they were Zeidel. But you come to America, and because in German they would write it with an S, then in English it becomes an S, and then it's becomes Seidel. Gershon says the sound Yecheskel attributes to Merkava's his Hebrew word room. Okay, room is room, but again, from what our point is that why is there a sound if this whole vision is just a prophetic way of speaking of what's going on in the spheres? There shouldn't be sounds if in accordance with the scientific truths. It's no different than having a prophecy in which speaking about the sun rising. And what his point there is, the Rambam's point is that Yecheskel also mistakenly thought that that there was that this they made sounds. And so why stress this? Zev Harvey in an article claims that it was important for the Rambam to stress that even the prophets were not transmitters of Torah truth when it came to science. That and certainly not Chazal. That for science we have to go with the best information we have. Ruth says Yirmiyahu was talking about the first temple's destruction. The sages are describing the events around the second temples. Why would anyone expect the Romans to follow the playbook of the Chaldeans by the date? Well, the thing is that there's a the tradition is that the dates are all the same. That's the tradition. That now, is this historically accurate?
But they're not. There's tradition, and then it's reverse engineered to make it all be the same. And then
Okay.
what really was.
Okay, but that's again for our point. I mean, you could say that from a Rav Kook perspective also. That does it really matter if Bayit Rishon is also Tisha B'Av? You say Bayit Sheni Tisha B'Av, Bayit Rishon. We identify it with Tisha B'Av because we want to put it in the category of or the season of mourning. And that would work very well with Rav Kook. But his point here is only explaining the Yerushalmi there. When Yerushalmi says there was a mistaken calculation, the whole point of that is to explain that an incorrect record could be recorded in your memory. Now you could say, well, no, your meow is recording the correct date, but Rav Kook is moving on a different assumption, and it doesn't really matter whether Rav Kook is right or wrong here. It's what he says, though, that you can that what appears in Tanakh doesn't have to be historically accurate if it's coming for a different purpose. Rabbi Kalman, thank you. From Wikipedia, in 1930, he emigrated to Palestine. Okay, thank you. So he was back in America then during the March on Washington.
Yes, it says he traveled back and forth a lot. I read the Wikipedia page on him, and then he came back. He traveled often after he made Aliyah.
Yeah, the March on Washington is 43.
He spoke at the March
1943.
in Washington.
So it wasn't very easy to get. They would have to travel. They would go east. They'd go through India and then come around and well, that's what they did before the Japanese entered the war. I really don't know. I know Rav Herzog, when he came to America, he went down through Africa. He went to South Africa, and then he came up, and they would travel on these ships that had Navy ships escorting them. It was not an easy trip at all. But thank you for looking it up. Joseph, you say, I wonder if this drive for reinterpretation of the Torah in light of reason and science is connected in any way in the eyes of the Rambam and Rav Herzog to the sorts of pathways that seek to derive the existence of a God from the universe being rational and understandable empirically. Well, I think it's all part of the same universe. They're in this universe that we trust our reason and everything should be rational. I mean, but it's a more fundamental problem. I mean, what do you do? I mean, it's the same problem that they were confronted with when dinosaurs, dinosaur bones. So you can say that the dinosaur bones are created to test you, which is an evangelical idea. And or you could say that no, that they're from an earlier universe, an earlier creation of the world. Okay, so that was one approach they took, but they didn't deny the existence of it. So now let's say you have factual that continuous civilization dating back tens of thousands of years. Well, then you have a problem. So you have to deal with. So then you could. I mean, you find this in Rishonim. I mentioned also medieval authorities. Many of them, or some of them, were not convinced by these long lifespans. So what do they do with it? They assumed it's impossible to have such a long lifespan. They assumed as a factual matter, as a scientific matter. And so they came up with interpretations that it's really not the lifespan. It's the beginning of a dynasty. That's what it means. Or it's the beginning of it's the practices set up by this person. That's what we're referring to. Not that someone lived this long, or that the years described there are not our years. They came up with all sorts of different interpretations because there's two truths. There's a Torah truth and there's a scientific truth or a historical truth. And if something is an actual fact, that's what Herzog said. If it's a fact, well, then you can't just close your eyes to it. you that's not taking God seriously because what are you, you're just making you're imagining it. You're saying it doesn't exist, so we're going to imagine our own universe. So you have to deal with it. So that's what he's concerned with. Now, why, Janine? You say why was Herzog not familiar with the writings of Rav Kook? Well, a couple things. First of all, a number of these writings we're speaking about were not yet published in Rav Herzog's lifetime. Second of all, Rav Herzog he quotes even the writings of Rav Kook that were had been published and I know Rav Herzog pretty well, he's only quoting the halakhic writings. As far as I know, he doesn't really read the philosophical writings, because at least he could have referred to Eder Hayakar. Eder Hayakar appears. I could show you a title page that I'm going to pull. Well, I'm looking at my Otzar Chachma here. It first appears in. I'm looking at it right now in 1906 in Jerusalem. So Rav Herzog he could have known it, but he didn't. Now, Joseph says you read somewhere of Cook met with Einstein, and Einstein was impressed by the former's understanding of relativity, saying Rav Kook was one of the only few who did. Rav Kook was he well read in scientific archaeological books and articles to pick up instantly. Rav Kook was read in philosophy. He can make his way through German, and a lot of these things were in Yiddish, a lot of these things. So he knew Nietzsche. He didn't know Nietzsche in the original, but he knew all about it. He knew Bergson. He knew philosophy. He did not know science, archaeology. He didn't really deal with archaeology. But you don't really need to know science in the way that Rav Herzog did. He knew about Darwin, and he knew about, he had a layman's, or more than a layman today, maybe, or more than a layman's knowledge of what was going on in the scientific world. But in philosophy, he really did know. So anyone living in the late 19th century, early 20th century knows what the scientists are saying. And Rav Kook was well aware of what the Rambam's, how the Rambam, what he did with these matters, but he wasn't an expert at all in these areas. And Elena says the schools also don't deal with the non-existence of the Rakia. Actually, since you mentioned that, Shadal does deal with the Rakia. And I deal with Shadal here, and he actually, Shadal says in his commentary that the term Rakia is based on the belief in higher waters. That is, and Shadal says today we know there aren't these higher waters, but the Torah, this is Shadal, quote, the Torah spoke on a human level and according to human belief when it says, let there be a Rakia. But its intended message remains true and faithful that God set the waters in nature. So, Elena, in response to your question about Rakia, Shadal, who I wasn't going to deal with in these classes, although it's in the book, he says that the whole idea of Rakia and the waters above are a reflection, prophecy reflecting early understandings of how the universe was, that there was waters above us, even though scientifically that's not true. Rabbi Slifkin has a whole post or two dealing with Rakia. If you don't say what Shadal says, then how will you understand Rakia? What does Rakia mean? The whole description. It seems to be a scientific description, unless you say it's not a scientific description at all. It's a mystical description or something. But Shadal is a Pashtan. So Shadal says that the Torah also reflects, just like it speaks of God having emotions, and it speaks of God's in physical terms because people in those days believed in a physical God until they so too they it describes the Rakia this way. Okay, I think that is it, Rabbi Kelman. This is
So I'm assuming those who are at Rabbi Grumit's fantastic class this afternoon, probably we will discuss what the Rakia is. Those who are there probably know what I'm talking about. The way he went through every word in the beginning of the Chumash, really fascinating. So maybe we'll have a better idea what the Rakia might mean. But yes, thank you. Okay. No, thank you very much. Look
I
forward.
mean the Rakia the Torah describes as being between the waters.
Yeah, I
So
understand. On
yeah,
the second
so
day of creation. Yeah, yeah,
me
yeah. Of
personally,
course.
I'd like to think it means something more profound than just an old scientific description which the Torah is using, because this is, Maisa Bereshis. But that's what Shadal says.
Yeah.
Shadal says that you should not interpret psukim in the Torah in line with current scientific views. He says that this destroys the whole Torah's message. basically what I'm sure if you looked at Schroeder and the other one, I forget what's the other one's name.
Aviezer, Nathan Aviezer.
I'm sure they can explain to you how Rakia is in line with modern physics and all this. And he says, he absolutely says this is a mistake. And Shadal uses this approach to disprove the Bible critics, actually. This, I speak about this, that if you read the Torah in line with its original understanding for the people of its day, obviously there's deeper understandings, but in its surface level, he argues that based on that, we can disprove the Bible critics. I have this in the book. Okay. Thank you all.
Okay, we look forward to a number of Monday nights in a row without the Yontif interruption. But okay, and like I mentioned, I threw out the schedule. Like you can click there, it's the other classes coming up. Two new series beginning. Dr. Sokolow on Piyut on the Parsha. Tomorrow's title I sent is Bereshit, the Genesis of Piyut. That's tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern, followed at 1 p.m. Eastern. Rabbi Schulman's class on Sefer Yoshua. So those are tomorrow classes. So as I mentioned, Wednesday, Nati Helfgott will begin his series on Sefer Yecheskel. Okay, those are the new series we're starting this week. We got a couple more next week, but okay. Lila Tov, everybody, and be well, and thank you very much. And let's hear good news, please, God. Okay, Erev Tov.